I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but discussing Australia, China, and the United Kingdom. And of course, the overweening power of the United States of America. AUKUS is a very awkward acronym, and it's caused quite a ruckus. AUKUS, AUKUS, stands for Australia, UK, United States. The deal between these three parties to supply Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, although it will take a couple of decades for the contract to play out, has driven a stake into the heart in France about the United States and about the United Kingdom, though that was probably already there in any case. It has caused a division between Australia and New Zealand, which doesn't allow nuclear fuel of any kind to come into its ports, and perhaps most of all, it's caused a crisis between China and Australia. Not so very long ago, China was happily sailing alongside Australia as its closest trading partner and a major investor in the country. Now, it appears, the right-wing government in Australia has thrown its lot, hook, line, and sinker, with the United States and its policy of confrontation against China. The nuclear submarines are not nuclear armed, but of course, as we're always being told in relation to Iran, nuclear fuel is by definition potentially a weapon. The French have lost the best part of 100 billion euros in this contract. The United States and the United Kingdom, as a junior partner, have snatched it, pulled it like a rug from underneath them. Now, this takes place in the context of joint military maneuvers with the mighty Navy of the Netherlands, the United Kingdom Navy, the United States, and others sailing up the South China Sea, the clue being in the name. The Allies, as they call themselves, though none of them ever consulted their people about the policy of confrontation with China over such small matters as the Spratly Islands or the future of Taiwan, are clearly bent on a confrontation with China, which could very easily end in war. No, we're not going to war, I hear the apologists for this policy saying. But what if China goes to war? What if China decides that it's now history when foreign countries could sail their battleships around China, like we did when we seized Hong Kong? We bombarded China until it gave up Hong Kong. That was punishment for China's refusal to allow the British Empire to sell heroin on the streets of China. I'm not making that up. That is what actually happened. What if China decides it's not going to wait for the AUKUS flotilla to be up and running before it seeks to reunify its country? Taiwan is a part of China. Everybody accepts that. Even the majority of the people in Taiwan accept that. The victorious powers in 1945 accepted it. The United Nations accepted it. From the age of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger and the One China policy, the United States also accepted it. Now we're being told that reunification of a country might be a cause for war. Japan, and one of our guests has particular expertise in that, is another partner in what is becoming an anti-China front. So is India, which has historic conflicts, political and military, with China. So are we seeing the beginning of the lineup for the next war? Because if we are, it'll be the last war. It'll be the last war because it will quickly become a nuclear war. And if it's a nuclear war, none of us will be left to record the history of how it played out. I'm joined by a group of experts. I'm just the enthusiastic amateur. Let's go now quickly to the experts. Ken Livingstone, former parliamentary colleague of mine over many years, and twice the elected mayor of London, before, like me, being kicked out of the Labour Party. Ken Livingstone, how alarmed are you, and should we be, about the current drift, if I can use that nautical metaphor, towards confrontation with China?
Clearly there's a real risk of war, but I think the main thing driving this is America knows that within a few years, China will overtake America to be the largest economy in the world. And for all our lives, America's been the dominant global power. It's losing that. And I think, therefore, in the leadership of America, they are deeply concerned about this, and they're stoking up these tensions with China, which is madness. The simple fact is China's economy is growing massively. We'd be better off just trading with China. When I was mayor, I opened offices in China to increase trade and economic links up and all of that. And that's the best way for the world to go forward, not America stirring up another Cold War. I mean, that Cold War dominated the first 40 years after the end of the Second World War. Billions and billions of pounds of money wasted on weapons which we never used, and the same thing happening again. So I'd say to the American leadership, though I know they're going to ignore me, stop this anti-China nonsense, develop a good trading link, and just become diplomatic.
Christina Kostoula, you're the vice chair of the Communist Party in Britain. You have particular orientation towards China historically. Are you concerned that this is all getting out of control, or do you think China is actually in control of events?
We do think that China is in control of events. It is a cat that many people are trying to find a way to skin, but it is not going to be skinned easily. Whatever comes out of China is a warning that if Western powers go against it, they will actually hurt themselves, hurting their own interests. And this is exactly what we see. Some countries, like New Zealand, is putting trade first. And it shows another possible way of actually learn to cooperate more instead of being tied to the US war plans and be antagonistic toward China. And as you said, New Zealand does not want these warships that are nuclear powered to be traveling its vast seas. So what we saw from New Zealand is an example. Here is some sovereignty declared in the sense that they're choosing to have bilateral relations with China and not do what Australia is doing, which is to put all the burden, this exorbitant expenditure for this military transfer, that of course is going to be paid by the everyday Australian taxpayer. So China is our sixth export partner, our fourth import partner, and it doesn't make sense for our interests to go against it. But you see, our analysis is on imperialism, and what we see is an imperialist maneuver. And under imperialism, as Lord Palmerston said some 200 years ago, there are no permanent friendships, there are only permanent interests. And I believe that France is outraged, and we had some very interesting statements by the foreign minister, Le Drian, who said that allies should not be doing that to each other. But there you are. They are doing it because we have a clash of interests. It is a very clear provocation to China, and China very calmly is suggesting more cooperation, the need for stability and development rather than conflict, because we will end up hurting ourselves at a time when we need to recover from this horrible pandemic and the crisis of capitalism.
We know why Britain is doing it. One only has to look at the role of Britain in the Iraq War, for example, almost 20 years ago now. But why is Australia doing it? At least 30%, so almost a third of all Australian trade goes to China. China is a major investor in Australia. Why has Australia decided to pick a fight with China? Does it think somehow it's going to be towed into the Western Hemisphere? Does it not know that it's permanently where it is?
China, it is its largest trading partner. But in terms of investment in Australia, you'll find that 40% of foreign investment comes from the US and the UK. And only 5% right now comes from China and Hong Kong. So they're putting specific interests, prioritizing specific interests for that. But the Australian press is putting it quite bluntly, that this decision, this agreement, means potentially that the first Western soldiers, if there is a conflict, to fall in that region, in the Pacific region, will be Australian soldiers. So they will have to pay a hefty price.
Duncan Bartlett, you're a former BBC Man, Tokyo correspondent. Nowadays you edit the Asian Affairs magazine. You're an assiduous researcher and commentator on these issues. What did you make of the AUKUS?
Well, in some ways, I wasn't surprised that the Australians had gone in with the United States and the United Kingdom on this military alliance, because there's been, in the last few years, a serious deterioration in the relationship between China and Australia. They used to have a very good relationship, but the Australians have accused the Chinese of cyber attacks on their institutions. They say that they've been using journalists to spy on their government. And so this has led to a reaction from China, which has meant that there's been trade restrictions, trade embargoes on Australian imports such as barley, wine, and in particular coal. So the diplomatic and economic relationship between Australia and China has deteriorated. Another thing that's been happening in terms of geopolitics is that in an era of great power rivalry, the United States has been encouraging other countries to pick a side. Are you with us or are you with China? And we're seeing that affecting geopolitical relationships all around the Asian region. Australia has now clearly signalled under its new right-wing government that it is with the United States. As you rightly said, it will take some time for these nuclear power submarines to come into service. It could take a decade or so. But this could give Australia 10 nuclear-powered submarines, which were able to operate quite close to China, perhaps even in the South China Sea, presenting a real threat to China. It seems as though China doesn't have very sophisticated submarine defence capabilities. And also, as you said, these are nuclear-powered submarines. They're not going to carry nuclear weapons, according to Joe Biden. But it would perhaps give Australia the opportunity to get the enriched uranium, which could be part of a future nuclear weapons program.
I thought we were against nuclear proliferation.
That's been China's principal criticism of the AUKUS deal. So when Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, has been criticising this, he says that it's going to lead to undermine regional peace and security. It's going to intensify an arms race. And Wang Yi says it also undermines international non-proliferation efforts. Wang Yi says, how can America say that it's trying to prevent Iran developing nuclear weapons through a nuclear power program when at the same time it's providing Australia with the technology and the know-how and the enriched uranium that it might need for a nuclear weapons program?
Good question, that one, isn't it?
Well, this is one of the ways in which the Chinese are challenging it. Of course, the other way of interpreting it is that in this global competition between the United States and China, there's a struggle for regional hegemony, particularly in the Asian region, and Australia is now being pulled into the United States orbit as a key ally in the region.
Now, you say that China is weak on submarine defense. It just tested a hypersonic weapon that has reportedly, in the US press, left the Pentagon and military experts in the United States lost for words, defying the laws of physics, this weapon. China is a mighty military power. Why would anyone want to pick a fight with it?
If those reports are to be believed, George, that hypersonic weapon circled the world before hitting its target. And that would mean that China has effectively won the race in this particular form of defence technology. No wonder the United States is concerned. There are also reports coming out of the United States that China is way ahead in other areas, such as AI and cyber warfare. So America is perhaps behind the curve in terms of the emphasis that the US Department of Defense is placing on conventional weapons, including submarines, aircraft carriers, and so on. But there's absolutely no doubt that China is investing very, very heavily in its navy and also in its missiles. Now, whether China is able to actually fire hypersonic missiles which could hit American targets, we don't know. But I find these comments about Wang Yi warning about an arms race particularly alarming. China says it doesn't want to be involved in an arms race, but I think AUKUS is pushing China into a very serious and very frightening arms race with the United States and its allies.
Let's hear from the Australian side. Professor Gil Bates is a professor at the Macquarie University in Sydney and a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Professor.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure joining.
Professor, are you happy that Australia is going to be a nuclear power?
Well, thanks very much, George, for that question. Of course, that question is a little bit loaded. The result of AUKUS is not that Australia will be a nuclear power. That's normally associated with people who have nuclear weapons. And there are 9 or 10 of them in the world today, depending on how you count. Australia will possess or will be operating, that is to say, if the submarines actually come into the possession of the Australian Navy, they would then be operating, yes, nuclear propelled submarines, which would involve nuclear reactors.
Under this deal, these submarines will be fueled by highly enriched uranium. Is this not a breach of the non-proliferation policy that we're always told about?
Well, I think it certainly skates up very close against them. Obviously, the fact that these reactors could produce or do produce highly enriched uranium that could in turn, in theory, be put towards a weapons program. Of course, presumably, there's going to be very, very high safeguards put in place for this. I don't think anybody, including the United States or the UK, have the remotest interest in Australia becoming a nuclear weapons power. And of course, it would require not simply those reactors to be producing highly enriched uranium. It would require an entire infrastructure to turn that highly enriched uranium into weapons. So, in principle, in theory, yes, I suppose there is a proliferation risk. In practice, I think it's highly, highly unlikely.
Will AUKUS lead to war with China?
Well, I don't know if the AUKUS deal itself would be the precipitating event for a war with China. In fact, I would say probably not, and maybe even certainly not. But if the question is this a reflection of increased tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, then the answer is almost surely yes. China, as you know, has embarked over the past 20 years on a massive military modernization program. It's a far more powerful, far more capable military, increasingly, I should add, capable of projecting power well beyond its immediate periphery. And I think for this reason, there is some counterbalancing going on. It's not just Australia, it's Japan, it's the United States, it's even smaller countries in the region who are concerned about China's growing power and what its intentions might be. So as a result, we do have a spiraling so-called security dilemma where the move of one side puts fear in the other and vice versa. And we have a continuing military buildup as a result.
Are you telling us that China is potentially a threat to Australia?
It depends on how you define that. I doubt very much that China has any intention to attack Australia unprovoked or to occupy it or anything like that, far from it. However, China does, I think, have some interest in projecting power, for example, in the South China Sea, in ways that could affect Australian interests. Of course, China may well get into a war with the United States, with which Australia has a treaty commitment. And of course, even with a country like Japan, where Australia has very close economic, diplomatic, security, political, and other sorts of ties. So there are a lot of scenarios you could envision in which China uses force and after which Australia, for its own interest, may feel compelled to be involved.
Given the French reaction to the deal, talking about being stabbed in the back and betrayed, will this have any impact on the NATO alliance?
Well, I don't know about the NATO alliance per se. That's an alliance of some 24 or more countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom, of which France is one member. So I'm not sure it'll affect the NATO alliance as much as it's going to affect the relationship between France and Australia. That's been heavily affected. I think it's going to take a lot of time and effort for those two countries to resume a relationship close to where it was, say, a year or even 5 years ago. I guess one question here is the degree to which France may more proactively pursue the idea of a European military force rather than NATO, which has been something France has talked about for a long time. That there's a lot of obstacles to getting that done, but maybe this episode is further impetus for France to want to pursue something like that. So then in that case, it would have an effect upon the salience and relevance of NATO, but I don't see an immediate impact beyond really the Australia-France relationship at this point.
Much more of this after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen Television with me, George Galloway, here in London, but discussing parts far flung. Ken, we were hearing there from Australia, and it reminded me that all of our lives, in fact, much longer, from Gallipoli to Kandahar, Australia has been a reliable partner of empire. They even fought in Vietnam, which the British didn't do. The British refused even to send a bagpipe platoon to play the music for the war. Is this because, it's an unkind thought perhaps, Australia, while it is where it is and will always be, its political leadership and its cultural leadership is essentially Anglo-Saxon, and it's really harking back to where it came from.
Well, if you look at the history, it was our colony, a very strong relationship. But over the post-war period since 1945, as America became the global dominant force, clearly it's working much more closely with America than it would be with the UK. We're no longer that global superpower. And the real worry I have is that they are provoking China more and more. And China doesn't want to go to war. America has over half of all the nuclear weapons on this planet under its control. So if there was a war between China and America, China would just be wiped out by America's nuclear weapons. So there's no danger of this. And it really annoys me that so much of our media is being dominated by all this talk of this potential conflict. Our politicians should be sitting down and saying, look, we don't want to go down this route. We don't want to run the risk of war. Let's develop increasing trade and cultural links and so on. Look at the number of Chinese people who come here as tourists to Britain.
And
students. They love it. Yeah. I mean, that's the link we should be building.
Christina, they vaguely give off a sense of peril emanating from China, but they never actually say what it is that China has done wrong. Even the professor there, the only thing he could mention was that China had built a powerful military. Well, not as powerful as the United States.
No, it's lifted more people out of poverty than in any time in human history. 600 million Chinese.
Well, perhaps
that's where their money's been going.
Perhaps that's
This is
the
the
problem.
threat to imperialism.
Yeah, perhaps that's their problem. But do you see my point? China hasn't actually done anything against anybody,
On the contrary,
even Taiwan.
On the contrary, it is at every point talking about cooperation. And it shows, though, an alternative that in this decaying system we're living in, let's face it, it is an alternative that is threatening the status quo. They are talking about investment in productive industry, right? And here we are talking about trying to bypass or overcome this systemic crisis with another war. And there's talk of new militarism, creating jobs in Australia. A blatant lie. Why don't we follow China's example of lifting people out of poverty? We're talking here about children facing hunger. And do we really want another war? Can we not spend these billions on education, on welfare, on health? On the environment, what is preventing us? Well, of course, it is imperialism. But what we should emphasize is that this agreement shows a split in the imperialist front. The imperialists, even though they want to project this image of strength, which is what is needed right now with China and Russia threatening their world domination, what is happening, we see a split in two camps. We have NATO and we also have Europe. Europe, in September, the president of the Commission, of the European Commission, Ursula von Leyen, talked about the need and to have a strong Europe, determined like a mother, juggling her many children. She actually made an example of her own self. I'm sure that a lot of working class mothers will have a lot to say about how easy it is in the current system to juggle children and work. But she said that we should follow the example of a caring, determined mother, and Europe should emphasize youth, and 2022 should be the year of youth that sacrificed itself for others. So there is really a rhetoric for war and for the creation of a European army. We are starting with, they're talking about 6,000 soldiers, 5,000 soldiers of which can operate worldwide. So this is the way imperialism copes with this crisis.
Well, personally, I'd swap a European army for the NATO military alliance, but that's, I suppose, a subject for another day. The professor, Duncan, alluded to smaller countries. And it is true that the United States has managed to dragoon somewhat surprisingly, the Philippines, its leader, who only yesterday was being denounced as an authoritarian dictator, is now on our side. He's supporting the AUKUS. Others are much less keen to do so, like Malaysia and Indonesia. Indeed, both are against it. But it is true that there is a coalition developing. India, Japan, Australia, Britain, and the United States. Has all the kind of hallmarks of the run-up to conflict, doesn't it?
Well, what did Joe Biden say about AUKUS? He said, this is an investment in our most precious resource, alliances. And that's been one of the key themes of the Biden administration. It is as hawkish on China as the Trump administration was. Frankly,
Are you surprised at that?
I am surprised because the rhetoric that comes out of the US sounds very liberal and inclusive and forward-looking. But when it comes to foreign policy, there is an almost complete continuity, actually, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. The only slight difference is that there is more rhetoric about the inclusion of other like-minded countries, similar democracies, joining the American side in challenging China's increasing authoritarianism. That's the rhetoric that we hear coming out of the United States. And one of the key phrases is maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. That word Indo, I think, has been particularly chosen to encourage the Indians to see themselves as being a US ally. India, of course, traditionally has been a neutral country, but is now part of an informal defence pact with Australia, Japan and the United States, which is, I think, interesting in terms of what you were talking about as an alternative to NATO. At the moment, it's an informal defence pact, but I think it's quite likely that other countries could join. The United Kingdom and Canada, I think, could also be part of the Quad. So, again, what we're seeing here is this emphasis from the American foreign policy, particularly the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, making many, many trips to Asia, encouraging countries like the Philippines to come on side and support the Americans. Even Vietnam, America's former enemy, now veering towards the American side. Some countries are sitting in the middle. South Korea, for example, officially a US ally now, trying to keep friends with both sides. But it's not easy, particularly now we're seeing these new defence alliances and pacts being formed. It really is putting pressure on all the governments around Asia and indeed the wider region of the world to say which side they're going to stand with.
Well, let's talk to a man who knows, he almost certainly knows. Philip Ingram from Birmingham, England, is a former senior British military intelligence officer, although his website says he was a spy, which I suppose is the same thing. Philip, always welcome.
Good to see you, George.
What's going on in NATO, Philip? They're all stabbing each other in the back.
Well, it's not NATO. We've had a commercial arrangement between Australia, who are not part of NATO, and France to supply diesel-electric submarines. And that's not happening anymore because Australia has decided to partner with the United States and the United Kingdom to have nuclear-powered submarines, which actually makes an awful lot more military sense as well as regional sense when you work out what's going on around the area. So yes, France, UK and US are all NATO members, but Australia, UK and US are part of the Five Eyes community and the AUKUS community. So it's not an issue between alliances in any way, shape or form.
So why did France react that way against the AUKUS deal?
Well, I think we're seeing a little bit of the French spirit and a little bit of French petulance coming out because they've just lost, a multi-billion euro deal going into French companies. Remember, most French defense companies are owned by the government. So this is money that would come straight back into the French taxpayers' coffers. However, if you look very closely at the French reaction, they were very quick to call back their ambassadors from the United States and from Australia, but not from the UK. And that's because in the UK, one of the major submarine contractors that there is a joint French-British company called Thales. And I'm sure the French president didn't want to upset the potential of Thales getting some of the contracts that will come in if the submarines are built or partially built through the United Kingdom. And Thales is 25% owned by the French government. So, a little bit of throwing the toys out of the pram whenever the deal was lost, a little bit of petulance around why his intelligence agents and his diplomats hadn't found out about this beforehand, and then it's all blown over.
You're talking about a nuclear deal. It's not a normal commercial deal. Don't you think it's dangerous, this?
Well, not at all. It's not nuclear weapons. It's nuclear power. And that's the big difference. These submarines will carry conventional weapons and they will have conventional tasks. Remember, one of the roles of the submarines, of any submarine, is to gather intelligence. The Five Eyes community, of which consists of Australia, UK, US, Canada, New Zealand, that's been put together from an intelligence perspective. So the nuclear-powered submarines mean that they can go out and do tasks much further away, stay on task much longer, and they don't need the same level of surface support vessels that mean that they would be easily detectable. And Australia's a big place, and the region's a big place. And given what China is doing in the region with its military capability, it allows the Western powers to potentially have another option in their golf bag of options, so to speak.
But it's for a military purpose. It's not highly enriched uranium for civil purposes.
Well, no, there are no civilian shipping with nuclear engines in them. Nuclear technology is restricted. There are only 6 nations in the world at the moment that have nuclear-powered submarines, of which China and Russia are 2 of them. India is a 3rd, and we've got United States, France, and the United Kingdom, and then Australia will become the 7th nation. So whenever it came to Australia choosing, once they decided they didn't want the diesel-electric submarines anymore, which wouldn't meet their military capability, I personally don't understand why they'll have decided to go for them in the first place. But the contract was running way over and getting more and more and more expensive, and the delivery date was being pushed back. So something had to happen, and they had been warning the French for quite a while. But then their choice for going for technology was either France, who produce nuclear-powered submarines, or the UK and the US, who produce nuclear-powered submarines.
Under the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we're supposed to be restricting the number of countries developing potential nuclear weapon capability. And yet here America and the UK are effectively propelling Australia into that division.
Well, this is no, that it isn't right. It's not linked. This isn't nuclear weapons. This is nuclear power. This is the propulsion system. There are no nuclear weapons going to be on these submarines. There are no nuclear weapons going to be in Australia. There is no expansion of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons capability into the region because of this deal. So it has nothing to do with nuclear weapons, and therefore is not covered by any of the international treaties regarding the proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world, because it's nuclear power. What it does is it generates steam. That steam is used in the propulsion system to generate electricity on board the submarine and to turn the shafts that drive the propellers.
But here it's for a military purpose, correct?
Well, you don't have nuclear-powered civilian vessels, and therefore the submarines, yes, are for military use. They are protecting Australia. They are helping Australia meet its wider Five Eyes commitments with regard to intelligence support, and it's helping improve regional stability by providing a countermeasure to the expansionism that's going on from China. Remember, China are producing the equivalent in ships of the Royal Navy every 2 years. Now, you only produce lots of ships if you want to go off and do something somewhere, not if you want to protect your own homeland. And therefore, this is a very, very small countermeasure to what is a huge amount of military expansionism in the region. The aggressive stance that China is taking over the disputed islands in the South China Seas, in the Paracel and Spratly Islands, where they're taking sand spits which have got no legal basis under international law, and then they're reclaiming land and creating islands and putting military bases on them, which immediately have 12-mile territorial waters around them, again is destabilizing the region. And therefore something needs to be done to try and say to China, look, we recognize what you're doing. We need to have military capability that shows to you that if you do try and do anything, then we can react. And that needs to be capable technology. And the Australians are doing that.
Okay, if it's not a breach of the NPT, can other countries now develop highly enriched uranium to fuel their submarines?
Well, there are a lot of countries around the world that are developing technology around nuclear power. There's a level of complexity difference between nuclear power for civilian use on land and been able to shrink it down to the size to put it into a submarine. The technology is the same. There's not many nations around the world, A, can afford to do it, B, need to do it, and C, would want to do it. So, I don't think that the international community would stop other countries looking at doing that from a research perspective.
But there are restrictions at the moment on the spread of nuclear technology.
But George, you mentioned nuclear weapons again. This has got nothing to do with nuclear weapons. There are restrictions in nuclear weapons. There are restrictions producing weapons grade plutonium and uranium. This has nothing to do with nuclear weapons or weapons grade materials.
The world, according to James Bond. It's remarkable, the insouciance of all this. Iran has been pulverized by sanctions for having a civil nuclear program. Australia just got handed it gift wrapped. For all the soft soap there, Ken, he said it was nothing to do with disrupting the alliance. It was the French throwing their toys out of the pram. But it does drive a stake into the NATO heart, surely. It's not just that France lost this bumper contract. It's that its two NATO allies conspired behind France's back, very successfully as it turned out, in order to divert the Australians down their channel rather than the French channel. What we know about France, with its history in NATO, its a kind of more independent spirit in NATO relations, this is going to have serious long-term ramifications, don't you think?
Well, I think what we've got to look at, Britain has had centuries of conflict with France. They're not ever been our natural ally, and excluding France from this deal was bound to cause all these tensions, and it's going to get worse. And I just think, frankly, I just think back, the first 45 years of my life, Britain spent billions caught up in America's Cold War against Russia. Now it looks like we're on the verge of the same thing again against China. I don't want to be part of that. I'd rather, instead of spending billions on our military and on more nuclear weapons, let's spend it on the people of Britain and create a better country for us to live in.
Duncan, it's remarkable the point you made earlier. I've been ruminating on it, that despite the fierce partisanship against the Trump administration from the Democratic side, and the whole media echo chamber of Democratic Party politics, which is virtually every TV station, virtually every newspaper, they're following virtually an identical political line in foreign affairs. Is that Biden, or is it Blinken, or is there a secret government somewhere in the United States that guides both of them?
Well, I would take you back even further than that, actually, George. If you look at American foreign policy towards Asia under Barack Obama, I think you would see very similar principles. America has maintained its US military bases in South Korea and Japan since the end of the Second World War. And actually, America has always tried to deepen its alliances with those two countries, perhaps even during the COVID-19 crisis. There was a lot of toing and froing about who was going to give the most help to Asian countries as they faced the pandemic, with China offering masks and vaccinations, and then the Koreans and the Japanese and Americans all saying that they've got better systems to cope with the virus. So I think that this is a continuity in American foreign policy. Of course, there's been ups and downs about how much individual countries should be contributing in terms of troop numbers or missiles or submarines or expenditure to the alliance. But even under Mr. Trump, there's been no withdrawal of American presence from Asia. And so the Chinese see this as being an example of hegemony, what my colleague might call imperialism. And just to quote Wang Yi again, that's the Chinese foreign minister, he said that AUKUS is a reminder that these three countries, the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia, are pursuing the rules of the jungle. Wang Yi said, that's when the weak are meant to be killed by the strong. So in terms of the way that China is interpreting this is not about some change that's taken place under Mr. Biden, far from it. This is about the powerful Americans trying to retain their hegemony, and that's the word that the Chinese would use, in their region.
Nobody here speaks for China, but let me be blunt. If I were China, I would now act after the defeat in Afghanistan with the submarines at least a decade, maybe nearly 2 decades away, with every ship that's sailing atop the South China Sea being a rather plump target. If I were in the Chinese leadership, I would be saying, this is the time for us to act. We have to send these people a message now, when they are in a weak position and we are in a strong one. Ken made the point that the US has half of all the world's nuclear weapons, but in a sense, that's immaterial. If you've got any nuclear weapons, you can destroy, eviscerate the region, and if you've got big enough weapons, you can eviscerate the world, whether you've got 100 or whether you've got 10,000 or 6,000 as the US has. What's to say that China will not act preemptively in the face of all this?
I expect that there are hawkish voices within the Chinese Communist Party who've advised President Xi Jinping to do just that. But on the other side, there'll be people who are saying, look at our relationships with America, Australia and the United Kingdom for economics. We depend on Australia, for example, for a huge amount of coal. China's going through a massive power crisis this season. Lots of factories have closed because they haven't got electricity. They need coal from Indonesia and from Australia. In terms of America, the Chinese have invested a vast amount in the United States and vice versa. The Americans are still continuing to invest in China because they see this huge growing potential market. China's economy is still going to grow by about 5% this year, whereas, other countries, European Union and America probably won't match that growth rate. And even in Britain, of course, the people-to-people relationship is still very warm. I mean, as Ken was saying, there are thousands of Chinese students from the Chinese mainland who've come over to study at the University of Liverpool and at the University of London, where I'm currently a researcher. So people-to-people-wise, we have good relationships, and I think that those will influence the debate within China about whether to strike out against the American challenge.
Christina, last word to you. I believe that this era that we have now entered into will be the beginning of a Chinese century, but one of the hallmarks of it is the extraordinary closeness between China and Russia, economically, militarily, geostrategically. This vast expanse of land and people and power, energy, and so on. The future is good for China. Why shouldn't it just bite its lip in the face of these provocations?
Well, these are really extreme provocations. I mean, the cynical spy talked about the Five Eyes Alliance. That's
10 white eyes.
We have to remember, this is a shared intelligence network that acts as a single entity and produces statements about China and condemns China's record of human rights. I mean, what is this? Is this democracy? New Zealand, of course, I referred to it earlier, was not comfortable with this stance toward China. And it does show a possible way of putting stability, trade, cooperation before anything else. But what we also see is this myth of friendly trade, this myth that there can be cooperation under imperialism, shattering. The question is, who will lead the thrust, the imperialist thrust against China and Russia? And it seems that there is a split, a disagreement. There is a disagreement as to the priority of the target. European Union, the formation of European army is going to have as a priority Russia. And of course, intimidating Russia to drop the strategic partnership it has with China. NATO makes another choice now to prioritize China. Nothing good will come out of this for the working people across the world, for the taxpayers in Australia, for people like my native Greece, who, in order to make up for part of the loss of France, poor, ravaged from neoliberal austerity and memoranda, Greece had to give 5 billion to buy some French frigates. So nothing good will come out of this for the working people. We have to oppose this war that the US imperialism is dragging us to. If not, research is showing that 85 million people will die in the first 45 minutes of a general conflict like that.
85 million people dead in 45 minutes. Just think about that. Well, it's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you, and if it was, come back next time for Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television.